feeling?
To find out, we're talking with Liberal MP Jason Falinski and Labor Senator Deborah O'Neill, who joins us in the studio. Jason, I might start with you out at the polling booth there. What are you hearing from voters this morning?
They're very happy with the Parents and Friends Association out here and the bacon and egg rolls that are being provided. So generally the voters are well fed and very happy.
And what about on the political front, Jason?
Hang on, before we get to the political front, we have been doing crimes against democracy sausages this morning, where we've been crowdsourcing on social media the sins that you must not commit when you're putting together a sausage sandwich. Do you have any particular pet peeves, Mr. Falinski?
No, thank you, Mr. Serps. But what I will say is that the big one seems to be the egg and bacon roll this early in the morning. So we haven't quite got onto the democracy sausage yet.
Okay. Nice dodge.
Let's get down to business. What are you hearing on the political front there, Jason?
Look, at the moment, people are sort of very much focused on what's been happening on the northern beaches, particularly south of here in the seat of Warringah. So that's been a large focus of what has been occurring on the northern beaches. But I think across general issues, people on the northern beaches are very concerned about transport as a major issue, taxes, obviously franking credits and changes to negative gearing that Labor's proposing are huge issues for a lot of people in my electorate and on the northern beaches generally. And also, you know, as you were mentioning before, the environment has also been a big issue because of the storms we had about 3 years at Collaroy. And generally, just we live in one of the best seats in the country in terms of the environment, and people want to make sure that that's preserved.
Is that a problem for you, Jason?
No, it's not a problem. We've got a good story to tell on the environment. I've been telling it. People accept it and are generally very happy to hear that we do have policies in that area, because they don't get to hear a lot about that.
Deb, you've been an active part of Labor's campaign. What are you hearing from voters throughout this election?
I was in Dubbo last week, and people who'd voted Liberal for 40 years had decided that they really wanted to come up and tell me directly that they were changing their vote. This morning, as Avoca Beach opened the booth there, wonderful Captain Heidi rang and said the same thing. People coming to her and saying, we are sick of the cuts and chaos, voted Liberal, but we're voting Labor, and that's what we're urging people across the country to do. I mean, I'm glad that there's going to be sausages everywhere, but if we start to talk about barbecue economics as the way our schools are going to survive, we know the country's in big trouble. You know, it's $14 billion to go back into schools under Labor. There's a massive policy difference. And I was very interested to just see Jason talk about, you know, the environment policy, and he's talking about a storm off the east coast of the seat that he's near Warringah. Well, that there's a much bigger storm raging, and that is people's outrage that there has been a series of policies. I think it got to 12 with the government with regard to climate change, and the denial that has been a signature of the chaotic Liberal National Party, who are even having, you know, a divorce as we go to the polls in New South Wales. It's cuts, chaos, disaster. It's time to change the government for a much better vision for the future of Australia.
Speaking of cuts, chaos and disaster, one of the risks for Labor is that it's perceived as doing too much too quickly, that the changes and the policies are too audacious. Is that a risk that you concur with?
I think what happened with the groundswell of endorsement of Bob Hawke was people remembered, despite the stain of the Murdoch headlines that sort of washes over the community day in, day out, people remembered that sense of hope, optimism and belief in our country. And that's what Labor is offering with our
Does Bill Shorten embody that, the characteristics of leadership that Bob Hawke did?
Well, I think there's something very important about both of those men that I know. The first time I met Bob Hawke, he was supposed to be at a dinner for 40 minutes. 3.5 hours later, we were still there. And I said to him at the end of that, Bob, what was it that made you think that the Prime Ministership was there for you? And it's come out this week. But he actually pulled from beneath the table a little black bag, and he pulled out a picture of his mother. He literally was carrying it with him. So the power of somebody to inspire you to live a great life of public service was evident in in Bob Hawke. Now we see in Bill Shorten the story of his mother. And, you know, I've had the pleasure of working closely with Bill as a modern woman in Australia, talking about education. And I was able to say to him, you already know what to do about education. You've grown up in this family where your mother transformed lives. That's why Bill Shorten is of the same kind of inspirational leadership that the country hasn't yet seen because he's not the Prime Minister, but hopefully tonight he will be.
Because they both talk about their mother.
Well, women are very, very important, and the mothering and the care that is given to young people to give them a sense of hope and the possibility to direct the future is really, really important in our leaders. And that's the kind of visionary, heart and head driven, powerful leadership that this country needs. We don't need more of the same. We need a very significant change, and that's what Bill Shorten is going to offer. And I think we will see in Bob's in the same style as Bob Hawke, we will come to know Bill Shorten as a fantastic visionary leader for this country who delivers equality and not only restores and looks after Medicare, but actually provides that cancer package of $2.3 billion so people can get the care that they need. It's time for a change, and Bill Shorten's ready to lead.
Jason, this election campaign, Labor has been very focused on its team, whereas the Coalition has really put Scott Morrison front and centre of their election campaign. Is that because the team is lacking and still a little bit chaotic?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just ultimately governments are led by prime ministers. They set the tone and the direction of any future government. You need to really focus on the person who is leading your party to determine what voters do. I mean, Joe, I could equally say to you, well, Labor's had to emphasise their team because they want to hide their leader. You know,
that's not true.
You can look at it both ways. Well, I'm just saying you can look at it both ways, Deb, but you know, we've focused on Scott Morrison because he's got a good story to tell. He embodies what a lot of Australians want. I think he's had a great campaign. He's done a good job at communicating our message.
Jason, we were speaking with Senator Birmingham earlier this morning, who was saying, look, if you vote for the Coalition, then you'll get ScoMo for the next 3 years. Those changes have been put in place to basically put an end to the blood feuds that we've seen in both parties. But what about the underlying ability of the Prime Minister to bring together factions where really those divisions that have caused the tumult in the Liberal Party in recent years have not actually been resolved, just papered over?
I don't think that's fair, Josh. I think that they have been largely resolved. I think we've seen in the last 8 months a pretty unified government that's getting on with the job. And look, this campaign, Scott Morrison's made one thing clear. We will be focused on the welfare of the Australian people, and that's what our policies are designed to do. And he will make sure that the parliamentary party is focused on that as well. And I totally and absolutely applaud that from any political leader that makes that statement and whose philosophy encompasses that.
Deb, you sit in the Senate, and it's highly likely that whoever wins government will have to deal with a fairly mixed bag in the Senate. Are you committed to being a bit more constructive in the Senate as a whole to actually make policy happen?
Look, I really think it's important that we have a public conversation, a discourse practice in Australia, especially in the Senate, given, you know, I think it's about 40 years that we've had this problem of no government actually controlling the Senate or having very limited periods of time, and there were excesses in those times. We have to confront the fact that there are voices in the Senate that represent Australia, and I think the best way to deal with that is to deliver a solid Labor vote today. So I urge everybody who's sick of the cuts, chaos and the mess that they see in Canberra to vote for Labor today so we can govern well and have enough numbers in the Senate to get on with the job. But we will also have to accept that there will be people who hold different views on those crossbenchers who need to get a message from the Australian people today that they want the Labor suite of policies to be implemented. People want to get on with their lives. They're interested in watching drama, you know, on a television show that's advertised as drama. They don't want drama in their politics. They want us to get on with the job of governing the country in a way that gives them and their families stability. People want their penalty rates back. People want to be able to go to a hospital. People don't want to be reading stories that we saw from the AMA today, where cuts to hospitals under this government have been so significant. There's been a 10% increase of mortality of people on waiting lists.
I'd rather just talk about your party rather than taking shots at the government for now. Just on the question of the Senate.
It's about people, Josh. That's the impact. Yes, it's about people's lives.
It is about people's lives. On the question of the Senate, if it ends up being the case that you win government, that there is a change of government, but that Labor doesn't quite have the numbers in the Senate to be able to do everything that it wants to do, do. Obviously, a lot of your spending promises are tied to the savings that you'd be able to make in terms of changes to negative gearing and to family trusts and franking credits and so on. If minor parties whose support you need balk at those... Yeah, sorry, Jason, just hang on for 1 second. I can hear Jason's trying to interrupt, but just stand by for 1 second. Deb, which would take priority? Making sure that the budget remains in surplus and therefore you'd have to probably cut some of those spending promises, or fulfilling all of those spending promises even if it means no surplus?
Well, we haven't got to have a binary situation as you've just described it, Josh. The reality is Australia is voting today. They have the opportunity to send a very clear message to the Senate, to the senators who are being returned and those who are already there, that they want Labor's policies implemented, that they want funding for their hospitals, that they want real action on climate change. To do that, they need to vote Labor. Now, it's not just about the numbers on the floor of the Senate, as much as that matters. It's about the message that the Australian people send today by voting Labor to all of those in the Senate, that they're sick and tired of the cuts. They're feeling the impact in their families. Young people who can't get a trade, unemployment, youth unemployment at terrible levels, particularly in the bush. We need to change the government. We need to work with the Senate that we're given. But Australians can send a message today. Vote Labor and let us get on with the job of governing for this country to make it a fairer and better place.
Jason, your response to that?
Well, look, I have a number of responses. The first is, it's misleading to say the AMA accused us of cutting health funding, because analysis after analysis has shown that the federal government, under this government, has massively increased funding to healthcare. Secondly, increasing taxes, Josh, are not savings, they're tax increases. And for the Labor Party to continue to describe them as savings just shows what sort of environment we live in, where we just play on words rather than actually telling the truth to the Australian people.
Jason, there's been plenty of wordplay surrounding calling the abolition of a tax refund a tax as well.
Exactly.
We don't need to get into the language of it.
Yeah, the con job that they're trying to pull the wool over the Australian people's eyes.
I give up.
Go ahead, Jason.
Well, you should.
Go ahead,
one at a time. Jason, go ahead.
And if I'm to follow Deb's line, well, Josh, I think we can all agree that a tax increase is not a savings. So when people talk about savings, when all they're doing is increasing taxes on pensioners and retirees...
That is not true.
That is
not true. When people get a tax refund and they haven't paid tax, it's not a new tax. And that misinformation campaign has alarmed so many pensioners across this country. The reality is pensioners
Hang on, Jason. Deb, we've heard from you a lot. Jason, I do want to give you the platform. I just want to sort of park this issue because I think Australian voters are frankly bored of it. I don't think people care what we call this sort of stuff. It's the sort of typical sniping that people get fed up with from politicians, right? So a tax refund, you're right, is not, whether you call it a tax or not, let's just agree to disagree. What's the fundamental point that you're trying to make, Jason?
Well, I think other people have called it overpaid tax. But if I'm to take Deb's point, which is that, if people want Labor's policies, then they'll vote for Labor in the Senate. Equally, you could say that when Labor, if they don't vote for Labor in the Senate, then they don't want their policies. I don't think that's actually the way to look at it. I think a better way of looking at it is in the UK, they have what's called the convention, the Salisbury Convention, which essentially says that the upper house, which is meant to be a house of review, and the State's House has the capacity to review legislation from the House of Representatives, but is not in the capacity, in particular, if a party takes a particular policy to the polls, to reject that more than twice in the House of Lords. I think that's something that we do need to look at in Australian politics, because regardless of which party is running, when they actually take a policy to an election, I think they should be given the opportunity to implement that policy and for people to have a view or to make judgment at the next election around the success or otherwise of that policy. And I think that too often in Australian politics, the Senate, for reasons that have very little to do with the policy at all, have rejected what the House of Representatives want and what the Australian people have voted for.
Okay, we're running out of time, but a very quick response from Deb.
Well, that's quite generous of Jason there, actually, to say that policy matters and that the Senate should look at policy, and I have to agree with you 100% with that. The sad thing is there was so much legislative change that we had to prevent that was being pushed up by the government in recent times because their policy agenda was chaotic, and in addition to that, it wasn't revealed prior to the election. So the reality is now we are here with Labor's full suite of policies around climate change, education, health, making sure that pensioners get looked after, for the first time actually be able to get dental care. All of these things matter. Politics, yes, it's an annoyance to some people today, and I know that, you know, people who are up to their eyeballs handing out today are a very, very different breed. I'm very proud to stand with all our Labor volunteers. But for people who are voting today, don't let the media, the bad angels of the media perhaps, tell you that your vote doesn't matter. You can change the nature of this country by your vote today. Vote Labor for the change the country deserves. Vote Labor to give everyone a fair go, all Australians, not just the top end of town.
OK, we've run out of time. Liberal MP Jason Falinski and Labor Senator Deborah O'Neill, thanks for your time this morning. And we're ending with a theme of concern.